Hey gang, welcome to Volume 20 of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. I hope you dig these, and just a heads up, as I was recording them, I noticed a couple of them were already read by some of the heavyweights, so please use the time codes to skip past the stuff you may have already heard. Don't want you getting bored out there in Scary Time Land. I hope you all are well, and thanks for subscribing and listening. So now, sit back, turn down the lights, and let me share with you some true scary stories. My Prophetic Dream by Anvilhead. 100% true story. Not really scary, I mean it is to me, but you might just think it's creepy. I knew this girl Sarah in middle and high school who had moved out of town at the beginning of my sophomore year. We had been really good friends, and I kinda had a thing for her, but I had a girlfriend at the time and never approached anything with Sarah. As far as I could tell, she wasn't romantically interested in me at all. Once telling me, "You're like a brother to me." She was quiet, shy, and a bit mousy looking. We were really close, and it really made me sad to think that it didn't go anywhere, and after she moved, we did stay in contact for a while, but eventually just went our separate ways as she now lived 8 hours away. During my senior year of high school, on a particularly warm winter Friday night, I had this really creepy nightmare. I was riding in a truck with Sarah, and she was really pregnant and crying. The next thing I knew, we were in a warehouse or a barn of some sort, with meat hooks hanging down from the ceiling. She was bawling, telling me how much she loved me, how scared she was and she didn't want to go. How she was so scared and wanted me to hold her, and that if I held her, she could stay and everything would be all right. Her pregnant stomach was suddenly split open and started bleeding, and there was blood everywhere. I woke up, went into my kitchen, and got this really sick feeling in my stomach. Just felt like something wasn't right. It was about 2 a.m., and it was a bit chilly in the kitchen. I felt like I was being watched, and figured I just had goosebumps, which I attributed to having just woken up from a creepy nightmare. I never really have been superstitious or easy to spook. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I went over to a friend's house, and let's call her Erin, for lunch the next day, who had been particularly close to Sarah. This is something I did on a pretty regular basis, as her place was only about 5 minutes away, and she was one of the closest things I had to a neighbor living way out in the country. She again was one of my best friends, not to mention I really wanted to bang the hell out of her. I hadn't told anybody about my dream, not a soul, but what she told me when I got there will haunt me for the rest of my life. That morning, Sarah's sister called Erin. Sarah was dead. The night before, at around 1:30, Sarah fell asleep at the wheel and ran off the road in her truck, which was an old, junky piece of shit that had no airbags. She had hit a huge steel support beam on the side of an auto garage, right on the side of the road, going about 65 miles an hour. The steering wheel split her stomach open, killing her and her unborn child. She was about 6 months pregnant at the time. Her sister had been in the vehicle with her, and only had a few cuts and bruises. Erin was crying, and I was too shocked to react. She told me how Sarah always had a thing for me. She had always loved the way I gave a hug more than anything, and I do give badass hugs. She had also shared with her that she always considered me her first love, and always wanted me to break up with my girlfriend to be with her, but thought I would be happier with my girlfriend, and she didn't want to get in between us. I was speechless. My religious beliefs lie somewhere between agnosticism and atheism. Although I feel like we can't know what we can't know, I feel like I haven't really been given any reason to believe in a higher being. Reminding myself about the accident in the dream not only makes me question my beliefs, but chills me to the bone. I still can't go into my kitchen at night without having that feeling of being watched and thinking that somehow Sarah was there. A very messed up house. My wife and I recently moved out of a home that I can only describe as fucked up. The house caused so much anger and hatred, and whatever entity resides in that place, it's pure evil. My wife moved into the home when she was a child, and her little brother one time were playing at night in his room with a leapfrog-type device. She described in detail about how she was showing her brother how to use it, and strange sounds started coming out of it. And then a man's voice began screaming from it. She said it was saying something about a list, something about making mistakes, and it just started screaming and cursing until she turned it off. So let's fast forward some. I met my wife a few years ago, and needless to say, she got knocked up pretty quick. Haha, wear a condom, kids. Anyway, I decided I would move in with her. That just seemed to be the logical thing to do. Sweet, no problem. At the time, I was working the night shift, 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. After a few weeks of moving in, I noticed something strange about the house. The upstairs where we lived seemed menacing in a way, like someone was always in the other room waiting for you. At first, I brushed it off as me just being nervous, new house, new life kind of thing. I also thought it was the insomnia I was having. Just pretty much steady work and not being able to sleep during the day. As time went on, I began noticing more and more stuff. Whenever the house should have been dead silent, things would happen. The footsteps up and down the hallways, knocks on doors, and sometimes I would swear I heard whispers. Being an avid believer in spirits, I wasn't particularly afraid, and that is until things started getting darker. One morning, as I was lying in bed watching Netflix and hoping to fall asleep, I heard a rustling sound coming from the closet. There was just enough light in the room that I could make everything out, but I saw nothing and thought maybe it was just the fan. Then something moved out of the corner of my eye, and as I looked at the closet, a dark ball moved from the closet to the bedroom door. It was about the size of a softball, moved about as fast as a person could to the door, walking. One night we were lying in bed talking baby stuff, and I noticed the curtain that covered the closet opening start moving. My wife was curled into me, facing my chest, and I was staring at the closet. As I kept watching, I saw what I can only describe as a tiny mist-like figure. Not white mist, but slightly darker than the rest of the background, and it moved out of the closet. It was maybe 3 feet tall, and vanished as quick as it appeared. As soon as I began telling my wife what had happened, she had a sharp pinch on her back. She didn't cry out or scream. She calmly rolled over and shouted, "Get the fuck out and leave us the fuck alone." Yeah, too bad that didn't work. Small stuff kept happening here and there for a while. Footsteps were regular, and I know some of you are probably saying, "Hey, it's the house settling, jackass." Normally I would agree, but not only did the footsteps stretch out the entire length of the 20-foot hallway, they sometimes were unbelievably, inhumanly fast. And the knocks on the doors were very rhythmic, like when you knock on a friend's door when they're home. After this recent Christmas, things began to spark up to a new level. One day I was sitting on my computer, and my wife came into the room asking me if I needed anything from the store. The computer room was directly across from our bathroom. Our daughter's door was to the immediate left of that, and the stairs were to the right. I began telling my wife what I wanted when she looked out the door and turned, ghost white. Her eyes got big and her mouth dropped open. She slowly turned towards me. I just saw a man walk into Elena's room. She began describing what she saw. It was about 6 feet tall, black and only slightly translucent. While she was describing this, I walked out into the hallway and went into my daughter's room. Ever walked into a freezer, like the big ones at Walmart? That immediate chill is what I felt when I walked in there. Of course there was nothing in there, but as soon as we began walking out, a set of metal bed frames that we had lying against the wall, for over a year I might add, slid down and fell to the floor. My wife turned back into the room and told whatever it was again to get the fuck out of our house. But it didn't, of course. Come January, things really picked up before we moved out. The power got knocked out during a storm one night, and we were left in the dark. My wife wanted nothing to do with this place at this point. She wanted to stay at her dad's. So we began packing her things for the night. I went downstairs and got my daughter loaded up in the car, and as soon as I started walking back into the house, my wife shot out of the door nearly in tears. I asked her what was wrong, and she only said simply, "I don't want to talk. Close the door. Let's go." The upstairs to the home is pitch fucking black, even on the brightest day due to the layout. So when the power is off, you might as well be underground. My wife was in our room gathering up her makeup and that sort of thing, just with a flashlight, and as she was loading things into her bag, she heard someone walk from the stairs, down the hallway, and right up against her back. At first she assumed it was me, but when she turned around and saw nothing but black, nothing like just black darkness, she went crazy. Imagine someone just holding a black sheet right in front of you. Just nothing but blackness. Even on our moving out day, things were happening upstairs. It was the worst I've personally ever felt it, just dread and sorrow. My wife once again had something walk up on her, and we heard knocks on the bedroom door while she was packing. We've gone back a few times to get a thing or two since we left in February, and every time it's just terrifying walking up those stairs. I guess I should end this on a high note. We've moved into a brand new home, and it's a completely different experience here. It's helped our relationship out a lot, and it's taken a huge burden off of us. I'm not going back to that place. A Walk in Ireland by Jonesy. While visiting family in Ireland when I was 18 years old, I decided one day to take a walking tour of the countryside. I left a note for my parents saying I was going for a walk, not knowing where or how long, since it was more of a wandering walk anyways. I didn't tell anyone else about what I was doing. After a couple of hours, I found myself on the far side of a mountain, across a valley and away from town. There was still a lot of daylight left, so I wasn't concerned. I was walking along a seasonal logging road and into a dark coniferous forest. And at this point, the last house I saw was about 30 minutes earlier. After 10 or 15 minutes of walking into this forest, I started to feel uncomfortable, as if I was being watched or followed. I took note of my feelings and raised my awareness of my surroundings as I continued walking along the road towards the mountain through the forest. I thought about going back the way I came, but the feeling was coming from behind me, and I sensed it was a bad idea to go that way. So I continued forward. After about 10 more minutes of this, I started feeling even more uncomfortable, like I was in fact being followed, and making this follower angry. I sped up and started watching both sides of the road as closely as I could. And then I saw something. Not too far up the road and off to the right, and just inside the trees, there was a white patch almost like snow. But this was Ireland, on the ocean coast in late March, and it was a warm day. There wouldn't be any snow at this time of year. I focused on it, trying to make out what it was. As I got closer, it became apparent. It was a small camp. Approaching the camp and squatting down to look around, I saw that it had a white bedroll about the size of a sleeping bag, a pillow, a small apple crate for a sort of bedside table, and several trinkets scattered on it including candles, matches, coins, and playing cards, amongst other things. I was pretty surprised to see this out in the middle of nowhere. But then I remembered the bad feelings of being watched and followed. I froze. My mind was speeding through how I could be perceived standing there looking at whatever this camp could be. Was it a criminal trying to avoid notice from the police? Was he watching me right now, about to attack, thinking I was going to steal from him? Or maybe he thinks I'm going to report him when I get back to town. I stood straight up and tried to listen, see everything around me at once. The feeling was still there and strong, but I couldn't hear any other noises. With the bad feelings lingering, I pulled out a 5-pound note. That's about $9 Canadian at the time. I held it high and waved it around, saying loudly, "I didn't know this camp was here. I'm just a tourist out for a hike. I'm leaving 5 pounds here for you. I haven't touched anything, and I'm going to leave you alone now." I walked straight and fast back to the road and towards the mountain, again not wanting to go back the way I came, where the feeling seemed to be coming from still. The farther I got away from the camp, the weaker the bad feelings seemed to get. I made it to the mountain, hiked up, over, and down the other side, finally hitching a ride back into town to the rental house my family had obtained. Later that night, there was a knock at our door. I answered it, only to find an elderly lady standing on the doorstep in the pitch dark. She was dressed in a ragtag combination of pants, sweater, coat, and scarf, all of it looking out of place, as if she collected her clothing items from a lost and found somewhere. I turned the porch light on, but the bulb must have been burned out, so she remained in the dark except for whatever light came from inside the house. She asked me if I had any eggs to spare. My first thought was, what is this poor old lady doing out so late asking for eggs? My parents, hearing someone at the door, came over to see who it was, heard the question, and started tripping over themselves to grab eggs. I was totally caught off guard by this odd behavior on everyone's part, so I stood off to the side and watched everything take place, dumbfounded, looking for the old lady on the doorstep and my parents rushing around the house. After a couple of near-frantic minutes, they gathered eggs, a blanket, bread, some money, socks, and a sweater for the old lady. Giving these things to the old lady happily, my parents wished her well on her way. She received them with just a whisper of thanks and God bless, and walked out into the night. When they closed the door, they looked at each other, sighed, and smiled wide-eyed as if to say, "Wow, what a relief." I asked what the hell just happened, and they said she was a gypsy. When they come to your house, no matter the time of day or night, and ask for something, you try to give it to them, or you may get cursed. Laughing, I made some joke about superstitions and mentioned my odd experience to my parents on the far side of the mountain earlier that day. My dad's face went white. His voice was a little shaky, and he started to explain that the gypsies were mysterious people who kept to themselves, feeling very protective of their property and personal space. The forest back there in the woods was a traditional setup area for them outside the logging season. I probably trespassed into their space, and to make things balanced again, they might have wanted to visit us in return. I'll tell you what, that day was one of the most strange and uncomfortable days of my life. And hey, maybe there is some truth to those old Irish superstitions. It Knew My Name. Submitted by Don S. The following is true, and I was not on any kind of drug or alcohol, nor was I dreaming. I lived on Kauai for about 15 years, spending my high school years there. I had heard many bizarre and spooky stories, including stories about the night marchers. I had no idea that one day I would encounter them up close. In May of 1995, I went to the Big Island for a job interview. I didn't get the job, and I was marooned on the island as I was broke and didn't know anybody. I pitched a tent on the Kona side of the Big Island, far enough away from any of the resort area where I would not be easily found. This would be my base camp until I could get myself on my feet again. My tent was well hidden, and you could not see it unless you knew it was there. I pitched it on the only flat ground as the area is all lava fields. I saw many petroglyphs and a partially collapsed wall where I pitched my tent next to, utilizing that flat ground. One night, during the later part of the month, when the moon was waning and crescent-shaped, I bedded down. It was about 10:15, and I was just nodding off when quickly I came to my senses because I heard someone walking past my tent on the beach trail. It sounded like plastic buckets clunking together, so I figured the sounds was just someone out for a night dive. I laid still and waited for them to pass. I thought it odd that whoever they were had no lights. However, my single-man tent was covered completely with a canopy, and I could not see out. Then suddenly, someone came to my well-hidden tent and called my name in a clear and unmistakable, deep, masculine, guttural voice. I knew instantly that this was not a voice of this world. I could sense that this entity was enjoying scaring me, and it knew that I knew it was a ghost. It had almost a hint of mischief in its voice. It knew I was freaking out, and it knew my name to top it all off. Nobody knew me on the Big Island at that time. I certainly didn't tell the job interview that I was camping on the beach. I could also sense that this thing had to go, as if it had more important things to do. I laid still, petrified with fear for about 20 minutes, until I felt I was clear to go. I grabbed my blanket and ran as fast as I could along the beach to the lighted resort area about a quarter of a mile away. I later overheard one of the employees of the resort not too long after the experience who saw the night marchers as she was driving home through the lava fields after completing her night shift. I believe it to be the same night that I had my weird encounter. I looked up the date and the phase of the moon in a book of the Hawaiian moon calendar. One of the things it said was it was the time that the night marchers are seen. Another book explained the clunking sounds as calabashes suspended from a pole in which provisions were carried when on a journey in the days of old. This experience remains to this day the most inexplicable event of my life. The High Noon Standoff by Variable Booleans. I lived in a handful of different apartment communities with my mom for the majority of my teenage years. Some better than others. Incidentally, this occurred in the best of all of them. I was 16 at the time. There were a group of girls around 10 years old that I liked to hang around and play volleyball with. They hated me because I used to get with another kid and throw water balloons at them while they were playing. In hindsight, this was pretty creepy in and of itself, but at the time it was hilarious. Well, I'd probably be the last person they would have ever visited. One day when I was playing GTA in the middle of a summer day, they came and knocked on my door. I was going to make a smart-ass comment, but they looked pretty distressed, so I asked them what was wrong. They told me there was a weird guy driving around near where they were hanging out and wanted me to come by. I was the oldest kid in the complex, so it makes sense they would come to me for this. We went and got my buddy, who was 14 at the time, and went over there. Well, they were right. We got there, and there was this guy in an old truck still there just watching us approach. I was pretty fearless, so I flipped him off and started throwing a football with my friend for a while. The girls went back to playing volleyball. This is where it gets absolutely crazy. After about 10 minutes, the guy gets out and starts walking towards all of us. We decide to get the hell out of there, so we walk back towards my place, and he follows. I tell everybody to book it, so we start running, and he starts running behind us. At this point, I decide I'm going to get my mom's gun and scare this guy away. So we beat him back to my apartment and lock the door. I get the gun. Unloaded, total idiocy. And I go back outside to find he's still waiting with a nasty look on his face. I look him dead in the eye and tell him to get the fuck out of here and point the gun at him. He smiles, reaches into his belt, and raises his own gun right back at me. It's at this point that I completely shit myself for the first time in the encounter. I know I can't fire. I went completely numb standing there, gun raised for what felt like years. It was probably only about 15 seconds. Neither of us said a word. After that eternity, he finally lowered his gun and walked away. We called the cops, but omitted the part about my gun, but they never found the guy. I have not pulled a gun on anyone else since then, thankfully. I was the neighborhood badass forever after that, though, but I absolutely did not want that designation. I didn't sleep for weeks. I can still clearly see the barrel of that dude's gun staring me down. I felt like the smallest dude on the world for those 15 seconds. The Sailor Ghost by Spider Queen Demon. My first night working at a movie theater, I saw a ghost in one of the empty theaters I was supposed to clean. I started working at the old theater about 3 weeks ago, and one of my first jobs was to clean up Theater 1 after the crowd had left. I noticed someone was still there, though, so I waved, thinking it was just a person who hadn't left. It was a handsome guy, on the youngish side, in a sailor's uniform, the white kind like in old movies. Apart from being ever so slightly see-through, he seemed okay, and for a second I thought it was just some guy in a costume, but then I really looked and got a bit nervous. I wasn't extremely scared, and it didn't seem to be very off-putting. Plus, the other employees had warned me that there were some spooky things that went on in this old theater. So I waved again and went on with my sweeping, figuring the ghost would either do something, go away, or it would turn out to be a first-night prank on the new girl. The theater was built sometime in the 30s, so just about anything was possible. The sailor started to wave back to me, but then stopped, as if he thought I was someone else. It looked like he was waiting for someone. Finally, the third time I came back into that theater to clean, had to go get some gum off and more trash bags, I finally got up the nerve to say hi to the see-through sailor. So I did. "I'm sorry, have you seen a girl come in tonight by herself?" he asked. "I don't think so," I replied. It's my last night and she's late." All of a sudden, I stopped being quite so scared. Ghost or not, this guy had been stood up by some dumbass chick, and being the sort of girl who's usually one of the guys, I suppose I was more inclined to sympathize than get nervous over a little thing like Sailor's guy being perhaps a little more posthumous than my other friends. "She's supposed to come down from Mount Morris this evening," he said. Mount Morris is a town about 10 or 15 miles north of the place where my theater is, so I shrugged and gave Sailor Guy a smile. Maybe she got held up. The traffic on 19 is a bitch kitty this time of year. It wasn't too bad before. "You want me to look for her? What's she look like?" "Oh, brown hair, pretty green eyes, glasses, kind of like you, actually. Her name's Jane." I had just about finished sweeping, so I told the ghost I'd keep an eye out and then headed back to the box office to regale my coworkers with the nice ghost story. I was pretty pleased with myself, after all, seeing a ghost on my first night and not losing my shit. Perhaps I would be seen as a particularly cool-headed employee. Strangely enough, no one had ever seen a ghost sailor in Theater 1. I shrugged it off and got ready to clean up after the Rocky Horror crowd in Theater 2. I've always been a bit scared of ghost stories, but for some reason the ghost in the theater really didn't bother me too much. I shrugged it off as my own goofy imagination and resigned it to the mental file of amusing anecdotes to tell Mom at brunch. The next Sunday, however, when I told my mom and Grandma about the sailor, I didn't quite get the reaction I expected. Grandma, who was normally a badass's badass, the kind of older lady who drives a classic hot rod, posts on the internet, and is generally scared of nothing, she went absolutely chalk white and then started to cry. As I mentioned, my grandmother's a rather tough lady. She's a hip flask-packing party girl who learned to smoke and drink at the age of 6 during the height of Prohibition. Incidentally, she gave up cigarettes in the 60s, not due to cancer, but because a commercial struck her as anti-feminist. I had only seen her cry at family funerals, and even then only after a bit of scotch, so I was pretty damn freaked out to see her crying. And then I remembered, when she was younger, she went by her middle name, Jane. Long story short, my grandma was once a co-ed at the same college I attend. She used to drive to classes from her parents' boarding house in Mount Morris. Her boyfriend of 6 months had dropped out of school to join the Navy after Pearl Harbor, and the night of their last date, she got a flat tire outside of Star City. Another male student helped her with that tire, and after her sailor boyfriend was killed in the Pacific, her letters to the friend she had met that night, who was in the Army, European theater, took a more romantic turn. The long and short of it was that she had stood up the sailor that night she met my grandfather. As far as any of us can tell, the sailor only appeared to me because I look a hell of a lot like my grandma did when she was my age. After a while, I quit the theater. It's awkward enough running into your own exes there. My former boss is thinking about rerunning Casablanca this year around Christmas time, though. Maybe Grandma can finally make that date. Angry Freak in the Forest by Welsh 85. I am an avid mountain walker and spend most weekends trekking the mountains and hills of South Wales. I have done this for over 15 years, and within that time only twice I ever felt genuinely concerned for my safety. Once when I was confronted by a bull, and the other in the following story. It was a boiling hot Saturday afternoon about 5 years ago. I was doing one of my favorite walks, which is about 14 miles long. This particular area was mainly forestry, but the tracks themselves were gravel. There were no other walkers and only a few cyclists, which was kind of typical with it being so hot. So the first 9 to 10 miles were standard. I was at the bottom of a track that would eventually lead to the top of the valley. About 50 meters ahead, I could see a man walking in the same direction. He was tall, thin, and had short cropped hair. He was wearing a white t-shirt, blue jeans, and black boots, and he walked with a strange limp, and that looked like he had to swing his leg around, almost like one leg was shorter than the other. I didn't think much of it. He was actually walking quite fast, so probably wouldn't have to overtake him. I carried on up the track. The sun was overhead, and it was sweltering. The man in front kept limping along, but nonetheless was making quick work of the incline. The track started to bend, and I lost sight of the limping man. The track comes up to a choice of 2 paths, east that leads to a small car park that is rarely used, and west which leads to the top of the valley. As I was about to head west, I heard a man shout, "Fuck!" It was coming from within the forest. I waited a second, and then another outburst. "No!" My first thought was, that guy must have tried taking a shortcut and had fallen over. As I made my way through the thick trees and ferns to see what was up, I stopped dead in my boots. Up ahead through the trees, I could see the man. He was sitting down on a log with his head in his hands. He then screamed at the top of his lungs. "Ah!" He then bolted up and started punching a tree. His face was bright red. He was raging. He then picked up a stick and started to bash it against a tree. I was frozen. I couldn't actually process what the hell was going on. He looked absolutely mad. He shouted, "I hate you!" and started stomping his feet. I simply thought, I need to get out of here before he sees me. I quietly started to make my way back to the track, careful not to fall over or make any loud noises. This man was clearly a lunatic. I thought I would go the more rarely used east track and then take a shortcut north through the ferns. This was probably the best way to avoid him. With every step, I became more confident and almost started to laugh about it. Maybe he wanted to let off a bit of steam and vent some anger. The middle of the forest seems like the perfect place, I suppose. So after about 10 or 15 minutes, the ferns started to grow thick, and they were at chest level. It wasn't a problem because they're fairly easy to push through. As I looked back behind me, I could see the limping man about 25 meters away, wading through the ferns towards me. He had a strange snarl on his face, and his head was bobbing up and down between the ferns. I couldn't believe what was happening. He must have seen me. There was no other explanation. I was only a mile away from a main road, so I started to speed up and walk a bit faster. I occasionally looked behind me and could see I was getting farther and farther away. I started to relax. It was over. I still don't know what to make of the situation, but the fact that he followed me through the ferns was the most disturbing thing. I have done that same walk over a dozen times since, but I haven't seen him again. My Aunt's House, submitted by Florian. I'm a 22-year-old guy from Switzerland, and I live in a small city called Brig. The special thing about it is that I pretty much have all the stores I need at my doorstep, but at the same time I live only 10 minutes away from nature. To the south of the city are mountains, as well as the Simplon Pass. My aunt has a wooden house up there, and as a kid I loved to be there. We went up there at least once a month. The way the house was built was just beautiful, and it was great for taking a break from life. But I remember the day my aunt told me why we couldn't be at the house on Wednesdays. So, the story goes that every Wednesday, the house gets visited by the family that built the house in the 1850s. Our neighbors would see lights turning on and hear crying sounds while no one was in the house, but only on Wednesdays. So my aunt decided to never be there on Wednesdays. I didn't believe it, even as a kid. I'm an atheist, and I've never had any paranormal experiences in my life. So years passed, and I turned 22 last week. I asked my aunt to borrow the house for just a little birthday party. I didn't want a regular birthday, but something special. And up there in the mountains with clean air and beautiful views, in a cozy wooden house would be perfect. I didn't want a big party or anything, just a good time with my friends. So she gave me the keys. We drove up on Monday and had a great time. Now it was Tuesday evening, and we were sitting outside, but it was starting to get cold, so we went into the house to watch some movies. And Logan is great, by the way. We started getting tired and went to bed. And suddenly I woke up. I looked at my phone to check the time. It was 2:30 a.m. on Wednesday. One of my friends was lying on the floor on an air mattress. The other two friends were sleeping in a separate room. I looked down at him, and he was already looking at me with big eyes. You heard it too, right? I didn't really hear it, but it probably woke me up. I could see faint light under the door. I got up and opened the door to see which one of my friends was still up, and as soon as I opened it, the lights went off. Just like that. I walked around the house and searched for someone, and finally I went in the room where my other friends were. I opened the door, and they were both there asleep. WTF, what's going on? I still didn't think about the whole Wednesday thing. It didn't come to mind at all. And then I heard footsteps behind me. I thought my friend had come out of his room to see where I was, so I turned around to talk to him, but I was alone. I was getting freaked out at this point. I decided to go back into my room where my other friend was. He was on his phone. He put the phone away and asked me which one of my guys was still up. They're both sleeping, dude. He looked at me confused and asked, so who was it then? I just shrugged and went back to bed. About 10 minutes later, we heard talking right in front of the door. It was a female voice, so it couldn't be our friends. My friend and I, both still awake, were just looking at each other while listening. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but she sounded like a child. After around 2 minutes, it stopped. We didn't hear or experience anything for the rest of the night, and the next day we drove back home. I thought about the things that happened that night. And then it came to my mind. The story my aunt told me. Did that really happen? I was searching for an explanation. My friends didn't know the story, so why would they prank me like this? And even if they did, how did they pull it off? There was no way for one of them to turn the lights on and off and get back into bed without me walking into them. And the footsteps. I turned so fast that there was no time to get away from me. So what was that? I will never go to this house again. I don't care which day of the week it is. The Drug House at the End of Our Street by Cobb 94. I live in a small town of about 8,000 people. It's kind of a country town, but very beautiful, and the people here are generally good. My neighborhood is one where everyone knows each other. New neighbors are often given welcoming gifts, and we even have a community Facebook page for reporting suspicious activities, and hold meetings every other month to discuss things, like the drug house, for example. We're pretty tightly knit out here. A few years ago, under mysterious circumstances, a small house at the end of my street was passed off to a drug dealer, and they have attracted all sorts of strange people. We've been told by our local police department to report any suspicious activity, and they've been to the drug house multiple times and have made arrests, but they seem to be unable to shut it down for good for some reason. One night, while driving home from work a little past midnight, I saw a man sitting on my front lawn with his legs spread out and a bicycle next to him. Startled, I was about to ask him if he was okay when I got a good look at his face. He had blood dripping down his forehead, and he was grinning ear to ear, giggling uncontrollably. I told him he needed to leave or I would call the cops. He replied, "It's too late," got up, and rode away on his bike. I routinely see extremely creepy-looking people walking down the side of the road, people dancing and other people riding bikes. Many of my neighbors have had their homes and cars broken into, and my parents' van has been broken into before. One morning I got a text from my mother asking if my girlfriend had sat in her car and smoked. I thought this was an odd question and was kind of offended, as my girlfriend is a very considerate person. Also, she doesn't smoke cigarettes, which my mom found in the car. Someone had broken into her van, smoked an entire pack of cigarettes, and put them out in various places. They had to have just left when my mom came out to the van, as the seat was still warm and a cigarette was still smoldering. Nothing was missing. Someone just used my mom's car to smoke in. We found addicts stealing mail and boxes from my neighbors' front porches, and I've seen drugs changed hands several times, all reported to the police. A guy who I went to school with from the time we were 5 years old ended up buying from there and dealing himself for a bit before dying of a drug overdose. I've recognized people going in and out of that house as well. I would say the creepiest people by far, though, were the ones who were the most active 2 years ago and terrorized not just my neighborhood but several others for blocks and blocks without ever getting caught, ultimately ghosting after their last act made the news. It started out weird but non-threatening. My neighbors' security cameras would catch them rearranging their plants or just stumbling through people's yards, seemingly in a haze. Sometimes they'd lay down in someone's yard and seemingly just look up at the sky and talk to one another. And then they started breaking into people's houses. One thing this group of 3 guys had in common was that they all wore white hoodies and were good at hiding their faces so none of the cameras could ever see them. They would also park their car a block or 2 away from wherever they would be. Anytime they would do something new, surveillance of them would be posted onto my neighborhood's Facebook group. It was chilling to watch them occasionally roll through my property, but also seeing them on other people's property and sometimes right next to their bedroom windows. One video showed them just watching my neighbors sleep through their window for almost an hour. Several miles away, a family with a lot of surveillance cameras got a shock when one of them randomly checked their security footage from the night before. He'd heard a noise, and while he didn't think the videos would turn anything up, he just wanted the peace of mind. What he found was that these men in white were stalking his family. There were tons of video clips of them moving around his property, peering in through windows, but something was different about them this time. They all had guns. Not only that, but they had left enough zip ties for each person that lived in that house, as if they knew how many people lived there. At one point in one of the videos, they looked at the cameras, realized they were being recorded, and left. And that was the last we saw of them. The news reported on it, and I think they just got too spooked to try anything again. At least not for a long while. The Airfield, submitted by Christina P. I grew up on military bases all my life, primarily in Asia and the Pacific. I have lots of stories, but the one I will tell you now is the most chilling. I was 14 in 1981, and I spent a large amount of my time walking around the base being an angst-filled teen. My friend who I called Pet and I were out walking in the late afternoon. The quadplex that I lived in was in the oldest corner of the base, next to the main gate, hidden by a natural barrier of tall hibiscus bushes. Behind my neighborhood was a small condemned zone with pre-1941 houses that had stood empty since anyone could remember. All of us knew that area, called the Airfield, was off-limits to dependents. I suggested we stroll through the Airfield. We agreed that we had always wanted to explore there but didn't want to go there alone. We both fancied it was like walking back into the past. The area was 4 blocks long and 4 blocks wide. The structures were typical, identically small, 2-bedroom houses. These houses could be found throughout the islands of Okinawa, Guam, and the Philippines. They weren't dilapidated, but were blaringly vacant. We walked in the empty street as teenagers tend to do, and chatted about boys we liked, poetry, and music. When we reached the 3rd block, I noticed a woman to my left. She was an Asian woman with a short haircut and a bob, dressed in old-fashioned khaki Bermuda shorts and a white sleeveless blouse with a rounded collar. She stood at the end of the walkway, a step away from the sidewalk. She had a toddler on her hip wearing a white undershirt, not a onesie, and a puffy diaper. It was only 5 in the afternoon, but Pet and I hadn't noticed the woman and child until we were passing them. We stopped talking, and I think we smiled politely, but we didn't speak to her. We took a few steps past them, and I whispered to Pet, "Do you think they live here?" She replied, "No way, these are condemned." Thinking that I should say something, I turned back towards the woman, but she was gone. I shrugged my shoulders, and we continued walking in silence. After only a few steps, we picked up our pace and were out of breath when we reached the end of the last block. We both stopped and looked back over our shoulders down the silent, empty street. It still haunts me that I think we saw a ghost that day. The Closing Shift Creepy by Muffy Mink. This begins in 2011. I had just turned 24, and with my cosmetology license, I began working at a hair salon down the street from my apartment. I lived in a very wealthy suburban neighborhood on the water. I called it the Sleepy Beach Town. Most nights I worked the front desk, closing with my coworker Becky. Becky was a shy and reserved younger girl who would easily get embarrassed talking to customers. I, on the other hand, was very extroverted and took pleasure in talking with anyone and everyone. The salon was divided 3 ways. There was the room to the left with a stylist's cut and colored hair. The receptionist desk was on the right when you first walked in, and behind it there was a wall between the desk and the back room, reserved for guest waiting, spa treatments, and shampooing. I had to approach from the side to get behind the desk. It started off as a typical night at the salon. There were 2 stylists finishing up a couple of clients in the stylist room, while I was busy training Becky on how to close out the cash register. The clock had just turned 6:30, and it was already dark out when a man walked in. He was tall and a true silver fox with a full head of hair. He wore a black North Face fleece, and he looked like your typical Pacific Northwest local. He asked me if he could take a seat and wait. Now, this is not a weird request in the salon, since many women's husbands come to pick them up and wait until their wife's appointment is finished. I assumed this man was doing the same. 20 minutes passed, and then he walked right up to Becky and I behind the counter. He looked down at me and says, "I've been waiting, but no one has showed up." I politely asked who he was waiting for, and he replied, "You know," and winked. "No, sir, I do not. How can I help you?" "Are you both over 18? He asked. "Excuse me?" I said. "I have good money, and I have been patiently waiting. Now I'm getting irritated. I want my massage, and I want it now," he said. Fear had crept over me since he started standing there, especially because he had his hand in his pocket, and because he was hovering over me in an area with no escape. And then I noticed the handle of a knife sticking out of his fleece, and the wristband of a medical patient ID. I signaled to Becky to call 911, but she had completely frozen. I told the man he needed to come to the front of the counter if he wanted me to begin his appointment. He slowly sauntered to the front of the counter, and then he leaned in and softly said to me, "I like that dark shade of lipstick you're wearing. Will you be wearing it for me?" That was when I grabbed the phone and made it very apparent I was calling 911. I quickly began giving a full description of him, including the wristband I had noticed. He turned around and left out the front door. I had this weird feeling that he wasn't done yet, so I locked the entry door, and a few minutes later he came running up, stopped, and stared into my eyes. His eyes looked empty and careless with rage as he began punching the front door. He slowly turned and quietly started walking away. While this was going on, I told everyone to remain calm and said it was being handled. Thankfully, the cop showed up immediately and detained him. The officer explained to me that the man had escaped a psychiatric hospital a few towns over, and was looking for a happy ending massage parlor. During our weekly team meeting, the owner of the salon told me that what I did was not protocol, and if that were to happen again, to get an adult to help. I left that salon shortly after, and am very happy with my career change into real estate. Creepy man escaping the psychiatric hospital for a quickie? Let's not meet again. I Fucking Hate People by Investigative Journo. A bit of background. I'm a 24-year-old male, recently became an independent freelance journalist after quitting my job at a popular newspaper. I am fairly successful, got a couple of well-paying people buying my stories, so that's awesome. I live in a really good neighborhood. A housemate and I bought a house with the money she was saving, and along with my money from my most recent article buyer. My neighbors usually keep to themselves. We don't worry about break-ins around here, and we can, the neighbors insist, leave our back doors unlocked. We don't. My housemate started noticing things going missing, things being moved around, money from our change jar vanishing, food from our cupboards disappearing. Naturally, she blamed me for these mishaps, even though I had vehemently assured her I was not to blame. But a year ago, when I left to meet my latest employer for a couple of days, these mishaps continued. She started freaking out and begged me to leave early, so I ended up rescheduling my meeting with the newspaper editor and left immediately. My housemate refused to stay there alone because she felt violated, so she was there with her then boyfriend. As I pulled my car into the driveway, I heard a bit of movement inside. I didn't think much of it, but I did think it was odd because it was going on 2 a.m, and both her and her boyfriend were early sleepers. I got my keys out and tried to unlock the door. There was a key in the keyhole already, so I couldn't unlock it, but as I tried in vain to somehow push the key in, the movement abruptly stopped. Then suddenly I could hear heavy footsteps, loudly thudding against the floorboards and making its way to the door. The sound stopped just as it reached the door, and all I could hear was my breathing, along with the breathing of the person behind the door. After a couple of seconds, it occurred to me that the person must be looking at me through the peephole, so I flashed a smile and waved a bit. After about 2 minutes, I started to grow agitated. I knew it must have been either my housemate or her boyfriend behind the door, since I could hear the breathing, but why weren't they opening? In anger, I shouted for my housemate to open up and screamed that it was no longer funny. That's when, all at the same time, I saw the upstairs bedroom light, my housemate's, flick on, and the person behind the door running, followed by the opening and closing of what I assume was the back door. After 10 long seconds, my front door opened, and standing in the doorway was my housemate and her boyfriend. My housemate was on the phone, talking to who I later learned was the police, and her boyfriend was worriedly watching her. After 5 minutes, she stated that the police were on their way. Confused, I started to question them and learned that neither of them were standing in the front room the time I came, but were fast asleep in my housemate's room. I realized it had to have been the mishap man. Funnily enough, it wasn't the thought that he broke in and could have killed my friends that scared me. What scared me the most was that he could have stolen my PC I spent a year building and upgrading, and that he could have been eating my food. We waited in the doorway for the police to arrive in fear we would tamper with any evidence if we moved. The police examined our house for the remainder of the night and a large portion of the next day, but could not find any forced entry or unusual fingerprints anywhere around the house. They advised us to install an anti-burglar alarm and other various security systems, but we really couldn't afford it at that time, so we decided we would have to do without. My housemate moved out to her boyfriend's apartment until we could both scrape up enough money to buy the security system. I stayed with a renewed lividity. I wasn't going to leave the house I had bought when the whole world kept saying millennials like me wouldn't own a house. After about a week without any mishaps, I left the house, which I was actively trying not to do, but I wanted to buy some pizza. I thought it would be safer to go during the day since burglars usually don't burgle during the day. After I ordered the pizza and eaten it, I drove home, but as I opened the door, I could feel that something was awry. I didn't know what it was, but I could sense something was off. I looked around for a bit and found that the mishap man had struck again. He hadn't taken anything, he never does. He just ate or stole some food from the fridge. But I was really fucking sick of it. I kept assuring myself when we would get the security system this will all stop, and it calmed me down a bit. I didn't leave the house for a while after that, choosing rather to order my food online, and when I did leave the house, it was only to meet potential employees to purchase my articles. And even then, I'd hire someone to sit at the house. After about 3 weeks of me doing that, I had a real craving for McDonald's. I just couldn't resist it. So I drove off as fast as the speed limit would let me, and sometimes above, to get my food and drive back. As I rounded the corner of my road, I saw someone with a black hoodie with the hood over the person's head fumbling at my door. I hoot. The person pauses, looks in my direction, and the minute the person sees me, he sets off sprinting towards a motorcycle I hadn't noticed that was lying on the sidewalk, and he takes off. I didn't even bother chasing him. I got out of my car, ran to my door, and rushed to take out my keys. But as I take them out, I notice there is already a key in the door. I ran back to my car, took out a spectacle wiper, and ran to the door to take out the key. The minute I took it out, I almost fucking drop it. It's the same fucking door key as the one I have. But to my knowledge, there were only supposed to be two, mine and my housemate's. I didn't hesitate to call the police, and my housemate to come over. I explained everything to the police and my housemate, and they advised me to change the locks immediately and get that security system they told me about last time. The next day, my housemate and I took out a loan and replaced the locks, and I made sure there are only 2 copies of the keys, and I buy one of the newer models of the security system we were urged to buy. It did take a while to pay off the loan. The mishaps abruptly stopped after that, and we've never had another encounter with that fucking mishap man. The suit. When I was a sophomore in college, I had a formal event to go to and needed a tux. I was over at a friend's one day, and she told me she needed to get her roommate a birthday present, and suggested we go over to an antique and vintage clothing and jewelry store just a few blocks away. I told her I might find a tux there, so off we went. As my friend looked at costume jewelry in several cases, I went back to the men's section of the small store and looked for a tuxedo. I didn't find one, at least not one I liked. But I did find a classic pinstripe suit, black with gray stripes. I liked it and looked at the price. $42. Something I could afford, and I could use a suit anyway. I was in a couple of student organizations that called for a suit from time to time. I tried it on, and except for the pants needing some hemming, it fit pretty well. I bought the suit and took it home. Alas, I lived at home during college. I told my mom about the suit, and she asked to see it. So we went up to my room, and I showed her the suit and tried on the jacket. My mom was checking the jacket out, feeling the quality of the lining and that sort of thing. She reached into the pocket and pulled out a small card. There were some words typed on it. I couldn't see. My mom looked very, very confused and asked me where I had gotten it. I told her I got the suit at a shop downtown, and she asked, "No, where did you get this?" showing me the card. I read the words on that card, and I felt the blood run from my face. I told her I'd never seen it before. She told me I must have, and I swore I'd never seen it before, and if it was in the suit, it was in the suit when I bought it. She said that was impossible, and we went back and forth like this for a few minutes. My mom was confused and freaked out. The next day I went back to the shop where I'd purchased the suit and went to the counter and spoke with the woman there. I asked her where she got her clothes, and she told me that she got a lot from thrift stores and places like that. She also told me that her sister owned a similar store in Ohio. I started to go a little numb then. Chillicothe. I know I went numb then. It was the numbness that comes out when we learn something that is almost impossible, but has still happened. I went numb because I was born in Portsmouth, Ohio, a few miles from Chillicothe. My father was also born and raised in Portsmouth. In 1969, almost 8 months before I was born, my father died in a boating accident on the Ohio River. His name was Bill Atkinson, and obviously I never met him. The card in the pocket of the suit jacket was a membership card for the National Honor Society. According to the card, it had been issued in Portsmouth, Ohio, and on it was his name. 20 years after his death, and 500 miles away at a random shop unconnected with anything else in my life, I had purchased my father's suit. Thanks for listening, gang. I hope you enjoyed this volume. Where I'm from, school is just starting back up again, so look for some creepy school stories coming up shortly. If you haven't subscribed, please feel free to do so, and share a comment or two down below. I answer all queries and comments, and if you would like to share your story here, email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. Please check out my Patreon page and see for how as little as $1 a month you can keep this channel going and get some interesting perks and other unpublished content. I think the outtakes are funny enough for the price of admission. Have a great day, morning, afternoon, or evening, no matter where you are. And remember, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.